In the year 1755, in the city of Lisbon, there was an earthquake. It was maybe one of the biggest earthquakes that the earth has ever experienced that we know about, where people were there to feel it. In about 5 minutes of intense shaking at what probably would be measured like a 9.0 on the Richter scale, if they'd had such a thing, this earthquake basically leveled one of the major cultural centers of Europe to the ground. And what's more, it happened on All Saints' Day, a major church holiday. And so everyone was in church. And the building that they were in, the major church they were in Lisbon, absolutely fell down on their heads and crushed everyone inside. Dozens and dozens of public buildings and institutions, including what was maybe the world's most major public hospital of its time, were destroyed, burning alive all of the patients inside. Maybe around 50,000 people were killed. Lisbon maybe had a population of about 200,000 people, and maybe 30,000 of the people who died right there in Lisbon itself. Major disaster. Had profound effects, not just materially on the city itself and the people who died, obviously, and so on, but also in the history of ideas, because the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 marks a major schism in thinking in the European educated West about the relationship between God and nature. When you see an event like that, or for those of us living in Oregon, we could maybe think of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake as like our looming disaster that they say is out there. If something like that happens and just absolutely ruins civilization to its core, changes all of our lives forever, is it so easy to think that God is up there kind of like a puppet master, just pulling the strings of earthquakes, hurricanes, rainstorms, this and that? Is God really behind it all? Is that really what God is up to? And that's a fascinating question just to ask yourself, whether you're a Christian or not. I guess it's a more direct question. If you are a Christian, if you believe there's a God, do you believe that God sends natural disasters to punish people? Or do you believe that God would answer prayers to change the weather to make people happy? So if you want a more lighthearted example, how about thinking about, let's say it's your wedding day and you want a really sunny day. Do you think that if you sit and pray like, oh God, please let there be sun on my wedding day, that God's like sitting up there like, I'm going to part the clouds for this one, And if you pray for sun on your wedding day, but it ends up raining, does that mean that God was like, no, I want it to rain on their wedding? Is that the way it is? What about with more serious things, though, like a hurricane? I remember back, I think this was around the year 2006 in the spring, maybe 2005, 2006. There was a Hurricane Katrina, that struck the Gulf Coast, particularly at New Orleans, Louisiana. And it was so destructive, so big. And immediately afterward, there were a few kind of Christian voices, not maybe mainstream Christian voices, but, voices that had prominence in media at least, or whom were amplified by the media, maybe just because of the strangeness of their view, said that God had sent that hurricane directly to punish the New Orleans gambling industry, which was kind of an odd claim, given that, a lot of the gambling, institutions maybe weren't totally destroyed, but a lot of homes and people's lives were destroyed, especially poor people who lived there along the coast. So it's like, how do you make sense of this? Does God actually do that sort of thing? This Lisbon earthquake caused a lot of thinkers to wonder whether or not God was really a good God, if God just allowed a natural disaster like that, whether he'd sent it directly or just allowed it as overseer of the universe, allowed an earthquake like that to destroy so many lives and so many buildings. And particularly the fact that it happened on All Saints' Day, on a church holiday, it just kind of gave it like this, it'd be like something like this happening on Easter Sunday when we were all in church, or something. It's hard not to see some kind of divine drama taking place. In the wake of this earthquake, then, the natural sciences and the and religious studies or theology began to, whereas they were once, much more unified disciplines, began to sever apart. As now people began to wonder, maybe we should start thinking about earthquakes in terms of just like natural causes, A young thinker named Immanuel Kant, who would be one of the most major thinkers of the 18th century, major philosophers, around that time developed the first non-supernatural theory of why earthquakes happen that we know of. Turns out he wasn't correct, but it was some stuff about the earth shifting and whatnot, and maybe he was on the right track. We know that earthquakes are caused by tectonic plates and things like that. The way people reacted to this earthquake, though, proved very decisive for thinking about theodicy. And today we're in this short lecture, which I'll cut a little bit shorter than some of the others because I've been rambling on long in the most recent few lectures. We'll be considering a poem by an Enlightenment thinker, Voltaire, French intellectual, who actually was an atheist and who took great delight in pointing out how this earthquake showed that maybe God wasn't so good after all. Maybe God's not so amazing when he allows an earthquake like this to crush mothers and babies and the wicked and the righteous and everyone alike. And then I want to consider, in response to Voltaire, one of his contemporaries, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famous Enlightenment thinker, a novelist and a philosopher, who wrote a letter to Voltaire telling him that his poem, "Thank you very much, sir, but your poem sucks, and we can defend God from all of this, and you're wrong about everything." Okay. And so in reading these, I think the messages are pretty clear. From Voltaire's poem, which is called The Lisbon Earthquake, an inquiry into the maxim, whatever is right, we find a denunciation of God and God's ways. The reference there in the title, an inquiry into the maxim, whatever is right, if you have the reader, and if you just turn back a page, there's an excerpt from Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man, also written in the 1700s, which was a big bestseller during its time, and had a conclusion, page 203 in the reader I'm reading, about God, namely, whatever is right, okay? The world, 'tis true, was made for Caesar, but for Titus too. So has a kind of best of all possible worlds sort of flavor to it. Whatever you see around us, it's correct. There's nothing wrong with the world, okay? So Voltaire's poem in its very title is set as a rebuttal against this idea. And it's pretty straightforward. He says, look around at the world, look at this earthquake, look at the results of the earthquake, crushed bodies, piles of corpses. Is this your God? Your God really is the one watching over all this? Count me out, he says. Just in various ways, over and over again. This isn't right. The universe is wrong. All these theodicy solutions you come up with, they don't work. Page 208, he kind of states the terms of what we call the theodicy triangle or the trilemma. Page 208 near the top. A God once dwelt on earth amongst mankind, yet vices still lay waste the human mind. He could not do it, this proud sophist cries. He could, but he declined it, that replies. He surely will, ere these disputes have end. Lisbon's foundations hidden thunders rend, and 30 cities shattered remnants fly, with ruin and combustion through the sky. So he talks in these kind of grand poetic terms about the suffering during the earthquake, asking, was God really in charge of this? Think about what you're saying, okay? If you say God's in charge of everything, you got to say he's in charge of this too. He doesn't just preside over picnics and beautiful moments and walks in the park and little birds fluttering through the sky, but also through disasters, through floods, through earthquakes. I wonder too, even just to reflect on this genre for thinking about theodicy. We've encountered many different genres so far in these lectures. Prophetic announcements from Isaiah and Habakkuk, narrative from the book of Genesis, philosophy from Plato and from others. Here we have a poem. Is this a good way to reflect on theodicy itself? Is a poem an effective way to deny traditional theodicies? Is it convincing? The way he uses emotion and this imagery of crushed bodies and mothers and babies. Is this effective? I ask rhetorically to you, O listener. Rousseau writes him a letter in response. Okay, Rousseau is a famous philosopher. He basically says, look, Voltaire, my friend. He's very polite to Voltaire. Look, my friend. He uses all these kinds of terms. You're kind of making the world look worse than it is, okay? He says, it's not as bad as you say. Rousseau says, be an optimist. I'm an optimist. Why are you such a pessimist? Optimism makes you feel better. Rousseau has an alternate theodicy, one that was very distinct to Rousseau, and which, I think is a pretty relatable kind of theodicy, and just as powerful as Voltaire's denunciation of God's ways. He says, look, people are free, and people are corrupted. And basically, we cause our own evil. God doesn't cause the evil in the world. We cause it because we're stupid. And we do stupid things. For example, Rousseau points out, why did so many people build so many high buildings in Lisbon? Why was the city so populated? Far fewer people, he says, would have died if we wouldn't have built these big buildings and everybody lives next to each other. Or if after it's similar to saying, like, after a hurricane that strikes a coastal region, why do so many people live along the coast? They don't have to live along the coast. Don't live along the coast. If you don't want to get struck by a hurricane, don't live along the coast. If you don't want to live in danger of an earthquake, don't live in Oregon. If you don't want to get struck by a tornado, don't live in the Midwest. It goes on, and maybe a flaw to the system is discovered. There's always a problem somewhere. You can't just escape everything. Rousseau also says that a lot of people died trying to save their possessions, so that's just human stupidity. You hear about this every time there's a plane crash, like that plane that went down in the Hudson River with Captain Sully, the Miracle on the Hudson. No one died in that crash, miraculously, but one problem was that despite the fact that the flight attendant said, as the plane's crashing, do not take your luggage, people were fighting each other and grasping and trying to grab their luggage. Maybe it's a natural human reaction, or maybe people are just babies and totally selfish and didn't understand the situation that they're in. So Rousseau would look at a situation like that and say, it's just bad behavior. Basically, people are dum-dums, okay? Like, don't blame God for you being stupid, okay? Voltaire had said, in the poem, that few people would want to be reborn in the same conditions in which they had lived. He quotes him on page 212 here, You think, along with Erasmus, that few people would want to be reborn in the same conditions in which they lived? I'm not sure if he's referring to the poem here or just something else that Voltaire had said. He says, look, ask any peasant out there if they're happy with their life. They're going to say yes. People on the whole are pretty much happy. Yes, we have problems. Yes, we have pain. Oh, that's another fascinating question too, right? Would you like to be reborn in the same conditions in which you'd lived your life again and again? It's fascinating to ask that question of younger people who are maybe in the prime of their life, and you're going to college maybe and doing great. Ask that, though, of some people who are living in less good conditions. Would they want to live their life again if they were born into the same kinds of conditions? Okay, maybe not. Maybe Rousseau says we're too obsessed with humans and human problems. Don't make out the problems to be more than they are. Rousseau appeals, like Conway did and some other thinkers, and Leibniz actually, to the idea that maybe there are other planets out there, which is a kind of a fun thought. Maybe there are other planets out there, he says on page 213, and maybe those planets are inhabited, and maybe there's just more to this whole question. God's got other things to worry about, We're just one speck of dust in this cosmos, okay? So he basically says, look, like, philosophers are crybabies. Stop being a crybaby, okay? All of this comes down to the existence of God, Rousseau says. If God is there and God is good, then God is just and perfect and powerful, and ultimately this whole situation is good. Ultimately, though, Rousseau says, this is on page 215, he says, ultimately, we've got to admit, we just don't know what we're talking about. We're all kind of in a state of doubt. There's a lot of objections, a lot of arguments, but we don't really know what we mean. He ends with an ad hominem attack against Voltaire, saying basically, look, Voltaire, you're living a life of luxury and leisure, and you're hanging out in Paris and drinking wine and eating at these wonderful restaurants, and the whole world sucks to you. Yet me, Rousseau, he says, look, I'm sick, I'm having problems, but I find hope in it all, so who can say? So hopefully in reading these two things, you get a sense of what's at stake for either thinker. For Voltaire, these horrible, gruesome images of suffering really do raise the question of, can God affect the natural order like that? And if he does, can you, O thinker, O listener, O Christian, O person out there, can you interpret the world correctly to know exactly which lightning bolt, which hurricane God has sent and to kill whom and when? Do you look at the piles of bodies and just say, the righteous and the wicked perish together? There's no order to it, and we can't say that a good God is in charge of this mess. Or do you look like Rousseau and say, look, let's not be dramatic about this. People are stupid. We do some stupid things. It's our own fault. If we could just be smarter, things would get better, and we wouldn't blame God for our problems, okay? I like the idea, though, of seeing these two thinkers back to back, Voltaire's poem and then Rousseau's response to the poem, for a wide range of theodicy views. All right, that's all for now. See ya.